Welcome to the Speaking of Writers podcast. I'm Steve Richards. This is the podcast where authors share the stories behind the stories. And today we're diving into the creative mind and cultural legacy of one of music's most fascinating figures through the lens of an extraordinary new book. Our guest today is acclaimed poet, critic, and biographer Robert Polito, author of After the Flood, Inside Bob Dylan's Memory Palace. Drawing on thousands of pages of archival materials, Polito offers a sweeping and imaginative look at the later decades of the legendary career of Bob Dylan. A period often misunderstood, but as this book shows, filled with reinvention, creativity, and bold artistic risk. Through an immersive structure and deeply researched storytelling, After the Flood reframes Dylan's so-called second 30 years as one of the most ambitious chapters of his career. Robert Polito, welcome to the Speaking of Writers podcast.
Well, thank you for having me, Steve. It's a real honor to be here today. And thank you for those very kind words about the book.
Well, thank you. This is such an interesting book and this period of time in Dylan's career. What first sparked your interest in exploring the later decades of Bob Dylan's career?
Well, I was very interested in watching him in the 1990s kind of reinvent himself. And I watched the Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award ceremony, which was one of the beginnings for the book, in which it looked like, I think, to a lot of people as if the career was just over, that was the golden watch moment, or the gold watch moment, and that, he would just fade away with maybe the occasional tour. But in reality, it was really starting up all over again. And during his acceptance speech for that award, he very explicitly kind of diagnosed the last few years, the prior few years of his career, as a kind of spiritual failing. And over the course of the 1990s, he released "Good as I've Been to You" and "World Gone Wrong." He resumed touring with a great intensity. He developed a series of very strong bands. And over the course of time, that led to Time Out of Mind. It led to him writing books and writing a movie, Masked and Anonymous, doing more sculptures and paintings. And in effect, in his 50s, reinventing himself. And I found it very moving to watch. And I was particularly struck as he started putting out records by the inventiveness of the musical and literary collages he was devising for himself during those albums, like Time Out of Mind and Masked and Anonymous. It's not Masked and Anonymous, but Love and Theft and Modern Times and Tempest, and similarly with the books that he was writing, particularly Chronicles. So it just seemed to me that the second 30 years really, or so, roughly, form a kind of unit.
The title After the Flood, it's evocative. What does the flood represent in Dylan's artistic journey?
Well, what I was explicitly thinking about is that the first poem of Arthur Rimbaud's Illuminations is called Après le Déluge, After the Flood. And in the 1960s, Rimbaud was a very important and crucial poet for Dylan, as he acknowledges both in interviews and in chronicles. After, I think it was Susie Rotolo who introduced him to the writing of Rimbaud. And what I was really thinking about was that the flood, in some ways, was, the 1960s for him. And I was interested in kind of what came later. And so the flood really covers, 1961 through 66. And most most books about Dylan really focus still on 1961 through 66, with maybe a kind of brief jump ahead to the Rolling Thunder Review. And everything that I write about usually gets handled in a coda in some ways. And so I was just kind of struck by, like, what does somebody do after they get everything they ever wanted?
You described Dylan's career as kind of a memory palace. Can you explain that concept and how it guided your approach to this book?
Yeah, what I was really interested in with that title was, like, how much knowledge is contained in those songs of the second half of the career. That the information, the knowledge that those songs embody in a kind of fairly literal way. Like, he'll write a song about the Civil War, but he'll compose it from phrases drawn from 19th century poets on both sides of the conflict. And it seemed to me that the notion of a memory palace, which is this kind of ancient concept that you see in writers as various as Cicero or Matteo Ricci or Augustine. It's a mnemonic device, but it's a kind of spatialization of memory, that people remember things by putting them in various places. And I think, the Dylan of the period that I write about very much wants us to remember, the Civil War and the legacies of slavery. He very much wants us to remember the War of 1812. He very much wants us, to remember, the genocide of Native Americans. And it just seems to me that, the kind of collage quality of those songs of this period lent themselves to a metaphor like the memory palace, that you don't necessarily write explicitly about something, but you implicitly investigate it and embody it through the different kinds of materials that you cite and quote and reference along the way.
Robert, did your perception of Dylan change as you immersed yourself in his later works?
Well, what I was struck by almost from the first time that I visited the archive in Tulsa, the extraordinary archive in Tulsa, that about how hard he works. There were, for lots of those songs, there were lots of drafts. And he would radically change a song from draft to draft. I mean, so for instance, the drafts behind some of the songs on Time Out of Mind is that he kind of went into the studio having written some songs that he then tore up, and then kind of distributed lines from those songs, of course, across the songs that we do have. And that was a kind of extreme example of the kind of um, revision and intensity of study in some ways. I mean, the way that he uses Ovid on Modern Times, for instance, or the way that he uses Homer on Tempest, or that sort of thing. And he's clearly somebody that works very hard, and you can tell from the bootleg series, but that was even clearer in the outtakes that I would listen to in Tulsa, like how much a song might change from recording to recording.
And still working hard to this day, still out on
Yeah,
tour. He's out on tour this spring. I'm based in Asheville, North Carolina. That tour is making a stop here next month, and he loves this
yeah,
market.
he's about to come there. Yeah.
Yeah. As both a poet and biographer, how did your background in poetry shape the way you wrote about Dylan's music and lyrics?
That's an interesting and very good question. I mean, um, one of the ways that I think Dylan can be understood is through the lens of folk process in some ways. The way that people talk about those great songs of the 1960s, that many of which have have kind of roots in songs of the either early 20th century or the 19th century, or even, earlier earlier than that. And I think at some point Dylan, realized that, it I don't have to limit folk process to music. It can include literature. It can include classical poets. It can, include novels and speeches by people. And this is to kind of answer your question. That's where kind of folk process for me bumps up against modernism in a way. The modernism of Gertrude Stein or T.S. Eliot or James Joyce's Ulysses in a way, that are also very much made up of collages, the way The Wasteland is a collage, the way that Ulysses is a collage. And I think Dylan very much, I think, kind of locates himself in that tradition. And and it was a tradition that I loved from my time as an undergraduate or in graduate school. Those are still some of my favorite writers.
Writing about a figure as legendary as Dylan can feel daunting. How did you find your own voice while writing about such an iconic subject?
Well, I worked on the book for a long time before um, I had a structure and I had a way into the material in some way. I had lots of notes and I was filling kind of notebooks with sentences and paragraphs and ideas. And it really wasn't until the release of Rough and Rowdy Ways in 2020 that um, that I felt I had a way in, because soon after listening to that, I came to the notion that that album was Bob Dylan's real Nobel Prize speech. It was his response in his own idioms and forms to the notion of winning the Nobel Prize. And almost every song on that record is either about making art or about, the kind of social and cultural and political worlds that he lived through and that his songs emerged from over the course of his life. And so that gave me a way into talking about, him reflecting on that album about his own processes, the way that create my own version of you through, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is among other things him, commenting on, the process of collage that you and I were talking about a few minutes ago, or the way that I've made up my mind to give myself to you is simultaneously a kind of love song, a spiritual song, but a song about his audience, or I contain multitudes with a very explicit allusion to Walt Whitman and the way that he's sort of locating himself in the traditions of American writing. So, that gave me a way into to thinking about what I wanted to write about. And the form that I ultimately decided on was it was an abecedarium of 26 chapters A to Z. And my first experience of an abecedarium was probably James Merrill's The Book of Ephraim, the first volume of his Ouija board trilogy, The Changing Light at Sandover. And I very much saw Dylan as a kind of medium for all of these voices, the voices, these musical voices, but also, literary and historical voices.
And for readers who may not be deeply familiar with Dylan's later work, where would you suggest they start listening after turning and closing the last page of the book?
Well, I mean, I don't know. My suggestion would be that, if you haven't read late Dylan, I would, maybe listen along to the reading. I mean, like, I'm not sure how much my chapters on Time Out of Mind or Love and Theft or Modern Times or Tempest, are going to make a lot of sense if you haven't listened to those songs you as you move along. But I would start maybe with, Time Out of Mind and Love and Theft.
He is Robert Polito. The book is After the Flood, Inside Bob Dylan's Memory Palace. What is next for you and your writing?
Well, I mean, shortly after I published this book, I edited, and it's just come out, a collection of novels by Jim Thompson for the Library of America, and it was great to get Thompson into the Library of America. In the fall, and this book is largely done, I'll be publishing with two other people, Sophie Brown and Robert Rubin, a book about Barbara Loden's film Wanda. We have total access to her archive, and it'll reproduce, not retype, but literally kind of reproduce page by page the shooting script, as well as some earlier scripts and materials for Wander. And I have an essay about, that guides the reader through those scripts, and Sophie has an essay about the feminist legacy of the film and the other screenplays that Loden wrote that were never made. And Robert Rubin has this terrific chronology of Loden's life. And then kind of after that, interested in returning to poems, working on another collection of poems. And I want to write a kind of sequel to the Dylan book, but it's not about Dylan, but it's about memory and film noir. The way that those noir films are very much about either the past of an individual or the past of a country like the United States.
So a lot more still to come from Robert Polito, with the book out now, After the Flood, Inside Bob Dylan's Memory Palace. If you love music history, literary storytelling, and the art of reinvention, this is a book that belongs on your reading list. Thank you for watching and for listening. Be sure to subscribe to the Speaking of Writers podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and join us again next time. Robert Polito, thank you so much for joining me.
Well, thank you, Steve. And again, I really enjoyed this, and thank you.
Same here. And I'm Steve Richards. Thank you for watching and for listening.